It began on a night when Berlin should have been asleep, yet Hitler paced alone across the floor of the Reich Chancellery as though hunted by something only he could see. Outside, winter winds scraped against the windows like claws. Inside, the lamps cast long, trembling shadows that stretched across the polished floor toward the door, shadows shaped like the ghosts of choices he had made. A thick folder lay on the desk behind him, stamped with bold American insignia. He refused to touch it again. Every time he glanced at it, a strange tightening gripped his chest, something he had not felt in years, the sensation that for once, the world was shifting beyond his control. And it all traced back to a date burned into the map room walls, December 11, 1941, when he stood before the Reichstag and announced that Germany was now at war with the United States of America. For months afterward, the decision had lived in his mind as triumph. He believed war with America would be swift, inevitable, glorious. He believed the United States was unprepared, disorganized, divided, incapable of sustaining a long fight. He believed the Atlantic was a moat big enough to drown American resolve. But now, years later, as he stared into the dim light of his office, those beliefs felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Something inside him whispered that the war he had unleashed across continents had finally awakened a giant he never fully understood. A knock cracked the silence like a rifle shot. Hitler didn't turn. He simply said, "Enter." The door opened, and an adjutant stepped inside, carrying a new intelligence report. Hitler's shoulders stiffened. He knew what papers brought at this hour usually meant. Failure. Losses. Reality intrudes through the cracks of propaganda. The adjutant hesitated, glancing briefly at the untouched American dossier. "Mein Führer," he said softly, "urgent figures from the Western Front." Hitler extended a hand without looking. The papers trembled slightly as they were placed in his palm. He scanned the numbers. Factories destroyed in the Ruhr. Oil reserves are cut again. Infantry losses climbing. Then, one detail that made his fingers freeze on the page, American production estimates. The United States had built more planes in a month than Germany could produce in half a year. Their shipyards launched vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. Their tank factories ran day and night, feeding an army swelling faster than any in modern history. Hitler's jaw clenched. "Impossible," he muttered. "These numbers are manipulated." The adjutant remained silent, but the tension in his posture betrayed his doubt. Hitler's eyes narrowed at him. "You don't believe this either, do you?" The adjutant swallowed. "Mein Führer, every report from every front confirms the same trend." Hitler tossed the papers onto the desk. They slid across the polished surface, coming to rest against the unopened American dossier, two documents touching like puzzle pieces forming an unwelcome truth. He turned away from the desk, but the shadows seemed to lean closer, following him as he paced. Outside, another gust of wind rattled the windows. For a brief moment, he wondered if the sound was actually distant artillery echoing through Berlin. The war was no longer far away. It was crawling toward the capital, building strength with every passing month. Hitler paused, gripping the edge of the table to steady his trembling hands. "America," he whispered, "should never have been involved." His voice cracked, though he tried to mask it. The images returned unbidden, December 11, 1941, the Reichstag cheering, banners waving, a spectacle of confidence and arrogance. He had declared war not because he must, but because he wanted to. He saw destiny written in the rising sun of Japan and believed fate had already chosen victory for the Axis. There had been no strategic necessity. Only pride. Only a man who mistook the roar of applause for the whisper of inevitability. But the applause had faded long ago. Now there was only the sound of his own breathing echoing in a room that felt increasingly like a coffin. Another knock. Another officer entered, face pale, holding a new chart. "Mein Führer, this is the current strength of American forces assembled in England." Hitler snatched it and stared at the numbers. U.S. divisions. Armor groups. Air wings. Supply columns stretching from British ports to the interior. He felt a slow, cold dread spread through him. An unstoppable force was forming across the channel, one he had invited into the war. This is exaggerated, Hitler forced out. It must be. The officer hesitated. Mein Führer, our own reconnaissance confirms it. America is preparing something massive. Hitler felt his throat tighten. He looked at the officer with eyes that flickered between rage and fear. They weren't supposed to be capable of this, he whispered. They're a nation of merchants. They lack discipline. They lack, his voice faded. The officer finished the sentence silently, they lack your approval to exist. Hitler turned back to the map wall where Germany stretched thin and bleeding across continents. He let his fingers rest on the Atlantic Ocean. It had once seemed so vast, so protective. Now it felt like a bridge carrying the weight of American factories toward him. He whispered, what kind of nation builds armies faster than we can destroy them? The officer didn't dare answer. A siren wailed somewhere outside the bunker. Hitler's head snapped toward the sound. Another raid. Another reminder. Another thread snapped in the web of denial. He exhaled shakily. When I declared war on America, he said, I believed they were soft. Unprepared. Blind. His grip on the table tightened. But it was I who was blind. The room fell silent. Hitler's voice sank into a whisper barely audible over the hum of the ceiling lamps. It was the only mistake I could not undo. He stared down at the untouched American dossier again. And for the first time, he reached for it. Hitler opened the American dossier with a stiffness that made the paper tremble between his fingers. The folder, thick, stamped, meticulously compiled, felt heavier than any document he had ever held. As he unfolded the first chart, he realized why. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't espionage. It was a confession, one written not by his officers, but by reality itself. The first page showed a graph of U.S. industrial output from 1939 to 1944. The line didn't climb. It surged like a tidal wave pulling away from the shore before the impact. Hitler stared at it long enough for the officer beside him to shift nervously. He brushed to the next page. Shipbuilding numbers. Aircraft production. Oil refining capacity. Steel tonnage. Ammunition output. Every category dwarfed Germany's entire wartime production, not by margins, but by magnitudes. America wasn't merely industrializing, it was unleashing something he had never believed possible, a war machine powered by geography, population, and an economy untouched by bombs. He had assumed, arrogantly, that American industry was soft, too civilian, too scattered, too complacent to be shaped into a weapon. But with every statistic he read, he felt something crack in his chest. America had not been waiting for war, they had simply been asleep. And by declaring war on them, he had awakened a giant whose strength he had fatally underestimated. He turned another page and stopped cold. A photograph. A factory floor. Endless rows of workers, men, women, even teenagers, building engines, tanks, aircraft components. The caption beneath the image read, Willow Run Assembly Plant, 1 beat, 24 Liberator bomber completed every 63 minutes. Hitler stared at the number again. Every 63 minutes. A new 4-engine heavy bomber emerged from an American factory like a loaf of bread rolling off a conveyor belt. He couldn't breathe. He flipped to the next photo, the Kaiser shipyards. Hundreds of American workers in helmets, welding sparks glowing like fireflies beneath towering hulls. The caption, Liberty ship launched in 4 days, 15 hours. He blinked. Reread it. 4 days. Germany needed months for a single U-boat. America built an entire cargo vessel in the time it took him to deliver a single speech. The officer watching him swallowed nervously. Mein Führer, these are confirmed figures. Hitler's voice cracked. This is impossible. But the evidence was everywhere, printed on glossy pages that did not lie. Even his trembling hands could not dismiss it. The truth had crossed an ocean in the form of steel, aluminum, engines, and manpower, and it was now hammering at Germany's gates. Another knock broke the room's silence. A second officer stepped in, sweat beading on his forehead despite the underground chill. He carried casualty reports from the Eastern Front, but he paused when he saw the American dossier open on the desk. Hitler's eyes snapped up. "Speak," he commanded. The officer hesitated. "Mein Führer. American units have been identified near the Italian front. Their numbers are far greater than anticipated." Hitler frowned. "How many?" The officer's voice faltered. "Tens of thousands. With armor. Artillery. Air support." Hitler gripped the edge of the desk. "They should not be there in such strength. America is deploying faster than we can resist," the officer whispered. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the concrete walls had leaned inward, listening. Hitler turned his back to the officers and stared at the map pinned to the far wall. Colored lines crisscrossed Europe like veins, but the American lines, blue, bold, relentless, had begun pushing through North Africa, Italy, and the Atlantic with alarming speed. His fingers traced them, trembling. "When I declared war," he whispered, "I believed they lacked the will to fight." The officer said nothing. Hitler's gaze drifted to another part of the map, supply routes stretching from New York to London, from Norfolk to Casablanca. Convoys. Merchant ships. Escort carriers. Thousands of miles of lifelines that Germany could no longer sever. The Battle of the Atlantic, once his strategic jewel, had turned against him. He felt a sudden surge of anger. "Where are our U-boats?" he snapped, turning sharply. "Why are the convoys still moving? We had the advantage." His voice cracked, too high, too strained. The officer stepped back. "Mein Führer, we cannot sink ships faster than they build them." The words hung in the air like smoke. Hitler lowered himself into a chair. His breathing quickened. Sweat gathered at his temples. He felt old suddenly, caged, trapped, cornered by factories thousands of miles away. "How could we have miscalculated so badly?" he whispered. The second officer exchanged a glance with the first, then spoke cautiously. "We misjudged their resolve. Their resources. Their unity." Hitler slammed his palm against the desk, startling them both. "No. They should never have become involved. I gave them reason, I gave them cause, to unite against us." He rose again, pacing, but now his steps were unsteady, his balance uncertain. "It should have been simple," he muttered. "Crush the British. Secure Europe. Keep America out." He struck the wall with his fist, his knuckles splitting. Blood dripped onto the floor. "But instead, I provoked a nation of millions." A long silence followed. He pressed his wounded hand against the desk. "Tell me something," he whispered without looking up. "How many men can America deploy at once?" The officer opened a folder with shaking fingers. 12 million, mein Führer. At full mobilization." Hitler froze. 12 million. His voice sounded distant. Hollow. Stripped of authority. He stared down at the map again, the Atlantic Ocean suddenly looking smaller, the American mainland looming monstrously large on the horizon. A nation with more men than he had bullets. More factories than he had cities left standing. More ships than he had U-boats. More planes than he had pilots. And all of it unleashed because of one decision he had made. One speech. One moment of hubris. He gripped the back of the chair, his voice barely audible. "It was my greatest mistake." But the truth was more devastating than that. It was his final mistake. Because there was no undoing a nation that had already crossed the ocean with its mind set on victory. Hitler remained silent for a long time after hearing the number 12 million. It echoed through the bunker like a disembodied voice drifting down a corridor, slipping beneath locked doors, spreading a coldness no heater could fight. 12 million men. A number so large it exceeded the populations of some of the nations he had conquered. His officers watched him closely, unsure if they were witnessing shock, denial, or the first fracture in the man their propaganda had built into a myth. Hitler finally exhaled, a trembling breath that seemed to drain the last remnants of the invincibility he once carried like armor. "Leave me," he whispered. The officers exchanged glances, none daring to linger, but they obeyed. When the door shut behind them, Hitler sank into his chair and stared at the map again. But this time he wasn't seeing the geography. He was seeing something else: shipyards in New Jersey, iron mines in Minnesota, factories in Detroit, oil fields in Texas. America wasn't a nation to him anymore, it was a rival empire, one he had provoked into awakening. He had once laughed at American industrial output. Now, he realized he had declared war on a machine. Footsteps approached outside, two officers arguing in hushed tones. "They say the Americans outnumber us 5-1 now." 5? It's closer to 7. They'll overrun Europe before we can even form a reserve. Keep your voice down. Their whispers trickled through the walls, carrying a truth the bunker could no longer contain. Hitler clenched his jaw. He had punished officers for far less than speaking out of turn, but now he lacked the strength to shout. He lacked the will. Instead, he found himself wondering, were they wrong? Or had he misjudged everything from the beginning? His thoughts were interrupted by another knock. The same adjutant from earlier stepped in, face pale, gripping a message with both hands. Hitler motioned him forward impatiently. The officer swallowed. "Mein Führer, a report from Admiral Donitz." Hitler leaned forward. The Kriegsmarine had been one of his greatest hopes, one of the last instruments he believed could cripple America before it grew too large. The officer read from the report, "This month alone, we lost 27 U-boats." Hitler's eyes flashed. 27. "Yes, mein Führer." His breath sharpened. To what? American destroyers. Escort carriers. Long-range aircraft. The officer's voice trembled. Their convoys are no longer vulnerable. Hitler gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. His fingernails scraped the wood. "And our losses," he forced out. "Crews. Officers. Over 1,000 men this month." The word struck him harder than any bomb that had fallen on Berlin. He had once believed U-boats could starve Britain, isolate America, crush supply lines, strangle hope. But now it was the U-boat fleet being strangled. American shipyards produced replacements faster than Germany could sink them. Their escort groups grew deadlier with every month. Their long-range bombers patrolled oceans he once believed too vast to survey. He closed his eyes and whispered, "The Atlantic is lost." When he opened them again, the officer hadn't moved. Hitler waved him away with a flick of his hand, but before the man left, Hitler asked, "What do the admirals say?" The officer hesitated. Hitler's gaze sharpened. "Tell me." "They say, mein Führer, declaring war on the United States gave the Allies everything they needed." He swallowed. "Manpower. Shipping. Factories. Oil." Hitler stared at him, eyes dark. "Oil," he murmured. "America has oil for a century of war." The officer braced himself, expecting rage, an outburst, blame. But none came. Only a hollow realization. When he was alone again, Hitler pushed himself up and walked to the map of North America. It had always been pinned to the wall as a reference, but he had never studied it closely. Now he traced the borders of the states, so many states. So much land. He stared at the Great Lakes, at the industrial belt that stretched through Ohio and Michigan. He whispered, "We never understood them. He remembered Goebbels insisting that Americans were decadent, weak, corrupt. He remembered Ribbentrop telling him they would not fight unless attacked directly. He remembered his own arrogance, his belief that America was a mongrel nation, incapable of discipline or unity. He whispered, "I declared war on an illusion." The door opened again, this time, unannounced. General Jodl entered, his face grave. Hitler shot him an irritated glance but did not order him out. Jodl stood before the desk with a stiffness masking exhaustion. "Mein Führer," he said, "we have received intelligence indicating that America's production for next year will surpass all of ours combined." Hitler's hand twitched. "All of ours?" Jodl nodded. "Across every front. Every branch." Hitler sank back into his chair. His breathing grew labored. For years he had believed that Germany could win through speed, shock, and force of will. But America didn't need speed. It didn't need shock. It only needed time. And he had given them time. He asked quietly, "What about their air forces?" Jodl stiffened. "Mein Führer, they are building more planes than we have pilots." Hitler's brows furrowed, but Jodl continued, "They are also producing replacement parts at a rate we cannot match. Every American bomber lost is replaced within days." Hitler's voice thinned. "And ours?" Jodl swallowed. "Ours are replaced, when possible." Hitler closed his eyes. The truth pressed against him like a physical weight. He had driven Germany into a war he believed he could control, but America had become something else entirely, a vast, relentless engine, burning oil and steel and manpower with a fury no speech could match. The psychological pressure cracked through him. He whispered, "When did I lose the war?" Jodl didn't answer. He couldn't. But Hitler felt the truth coiling inside him, cold and merciless. Not in Stalingrad. Not in Normandy. Not in the skies over Berlin. He lost the war the moment he declared it against a nation that could outbuild, outlast, and outmuscle him on every front. He placed both hands over his face and exhaled, the sound trembling. For the first time in years, Hitler felt the full weight of consequences. And the consequences were American. Hitler remained seated long after General Jodl left the room. He stared at the empty doorway as though expecting someone else to enter, someone who might tell him that the numbers were wrong, the intelligence fabricated, the reports exaggerated. But no one came. Only the hum of failing lights accompanied him, and the distant thud of American and British bombers pulverizing the city above. The bunker trembled with each impact, dust drifting down in lazy spirals. Once, that sound had invigorated him, proof that Germany was strong enough to endure. Now it sounded like the ticking of a massive, inescapable clock. He pushed himself to his feet and paced toward the far wall where several maps hung, Europe, Africa, the Atlantic, and the United States. He ran his fingers over the borders of Ohio and Michigan again, tracing the crescent of factories that had once meant nothing to him. He whispered the names like confessions: Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. Every one of those places had outproduced entire sectors of his empire. He had believed oil shortages, bombing, and sheer willpower could offset what he saw as American softness. But softness, he now realized, had been misread for abundance. Their wealth had never been a weakness, it was an arsenal waiting for ignition. A faint metallic sound drew his attention. Outside the room, two generals moved in hushed conversation. Hitler moved closer to the cracked doorway. Their whispers, thin but unmistakable, wound through the corridor. "America is unstoppable now. They will roll over the continent. We never stood a chance once he provoked them." Hitler stiffened. No one inside these walls would have spoken such words 2 years ago. But now they slipped from tongues like truth that could no longer be strangled. He stepped back from the doorway, cold fury rising, but it wasn't directed at the officers. For the first time, he found the anger turning inward. A memory surfaced, December 11, 1941. Hitler standing before the Reichstag, chest puffed, arms raised, voice echoing with triumphant certainty. He had delivered the declaration of war with the swagger of inevitability. He had believed it would be a footnote, an afterthought, a mere formality in a conflict already won. After all, at that moment Europe lay under his heel. France had fallen. Britain was cornered. The Soviet Union was reeling. Victory seemed as obvious as sunrise. But he hadn't understood America. He hadn't understood their democracy, their unity, their capacity to shift from civilian life to total war. He had assumed disunity. Instead, Pearl Harbor forged unity so intense the entire nation moved as one. Factories converted overnight. Production lines ran without pause. Men enlisted by the millions. Women replaced them in the factories. Wealth turned into machinery. Machinery turned into armies. And those armies were now breaching Germany from every direction. Footsteps approached behind him. Hitler turned to see Keitel entering with a bundle of fresh intelligence summaries. Keitel's face, once stern and resolute, now sagged with exhaustion. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes sunken. Mein Führer, he began, I have updates from the Western Allies. Hitler gestured sharply. Speak. Keitel unfolded a chart, hands trembling. In the past 6 months, the United States has transported over 2 million men across the Atlantic. Hitler's jaw tightened. Keitel continued, voice thinning. They now possess more tanks in Europe than we have remaining on all fronts combined. Hitler blinked slowly. More tanks, than all of Germany? Yes, Mein Führer. Hitler swallowed, a small, almost imperceptible action, but to Keitel it looked like a crack forming in a marble statue. Hitler stared at the map again, not blinking. How many aircraft? Keitel hesitated. Over 12,000 in the European theater. And more arriving weekly. Hitler whispered, and ours? Keitel lowered his eyes. Barely 1,200. Hitler's breath halted. His hand pressed against the map for support. The American Air Force was 10 times larger. A tenfold imbalance. He whispered the number again, as though saying it might make it less real, 10 to 1, a wave of dizziness hit him. The room felt smaller, suffocating. Not from smoke or dust, but from truth. He moved toward the Atlantic map, his finger drifting toward the U-boat Wolf-Pack regions. But the blue lines, American shipping lanes, cut through them effortlessly. Where once he had imagined victory through isolation, now he saw that he had invited the richest nation on earth to join his enemies. The thought clawed at him. He turned to Keitel. Why didn't anyone warn me? Keitel looked up sharply. Mein Führer, we tried. His voice cracked. Ribbentrop warned of American unity. Admiral Raeder warned of their industry. Even Goering, he stopped, realizing he'd gone too far. But Hitler wasn't angry. He was, listening. Keitel continued cautiously. You believed America would hesitate. That they lacked discipline. That they were decadent. Hitler's voice dropped to a whisper. They were decadent. But decadence can build, and build, his hand tightened into a fist. And now their factories cover entire cities. The bunker ceiling groaned overhead as another shockwave rippled through Berlin. Dust drifted like falling snow. Hitler didn't look up. He stared only at one place on the map, the Atlantic Ocean. He whispered, I declared war across an ocean I could not cross. Keitel didn't respond. Hitler stepped back from the wall, murmuring almost to himself, the day I declared war on America. I handed them the world. And for the first time, Keitel heard not anger, not delusion, not defiance, but fear. A whisper followed, barely audible, it was the day I destroyed myself. Outside, the bunker lights flickered. Inside, Hitler finally sat down, slow, trembling, aged by a realization that had taken years to reach him. He had woken the giant. He had armed the giant. He had united the giant. And the giant was now standing at Germany's door. The lights flickered again as Hitler remained slumped in his chair, the silence thick enough to muffle even the distant rumble of artillery. The bunker was breathing, its concrete walls groaning, its stale air trembling, its inhabitants trapped in a twilight between denial and collapse. Hitler stared at his trembling hands, watching the way the veins rose beneath thinning skin. He suddenly felt old. Not old in years, but old in consequence. Every decision he had made seemed to echo through the bunker like a thunderclap bouncing from wall to wall. Another knock, hesitant, fragile. Hitler didn't respond. The door opened anyway. This time it was General Bergdorf, face pale, holding a stack of intercepted Allied transmissions. He paused at the threshold, uncertain whether approaching was wise. But he stepped forward. He placed the papers on the desk and spoke in a voice that tried and failed to mask dread. Mein Führer, the Americans have reached the Elbe. Hitler's eyes twitched. Impossible. Bergdorf shook his head. Sir, they moved faster than any army in history. Their armored divisions are advancing 30 kilometers a day. In some sectors, 40. Hitler clenched the armrests. Where are the reserves? Bergdorf didn't answer. Hitler repeated, louder, where are the reserves? Gone, Bergdorf whispered. All gone. The bunker seemed to inhale suddenly, its stale air drawing back as if recoiling from the truth. Bergdorf continued, we have no fuel for counterattacks. No tanks capable of meeting theirs. No aircraft left to slow them. Hitler's breathing sharpened. What of the Volkssturm? The youth brigades? They were supposed to, Bergdorf cut him off with a pained shake of the head. They never stood a chance. American artillery shredded them before they even reached firing range. Hitler's lips trembled. And the civilians? Bergdorf looked away. They cannot understand how America became so powerful, so quickly. Hitler stared at him. Quickly. His voice cracked. This wasn't quick. They were always powerful. I just never saw it. The admission tasted like poison. Outside the door, Hitler heard someone sobbing. A soldier, young, maybe no more than 17, being comforted by an officer. Their words floated faintly into the room. They have more tanks than we have bullets. They have more planes than we have fuel. They have more men than we have rifles. How could we ever win? Hitler flinched at the raw hopelessness in their voices. Something inside him bent, ever so slightly, under its weight. Bergdorf cleared his throat. There is something else. He pulled a document from the stack. This is a captured American report. It details their production for next year. Hitler didn't reach for it. His eyes remained fixed on the table. Bergdorf read aloud. They plan to outproduce the entire Axis by a factor of 4 across all categories. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, rations, fuel, everything. Hitler exhaled slowly, the breath twitching with age and defeat. 4 times, he murmured. 4 armies against our 1. Bergdorf hesitated. Mein Führer, you once said that quantity has a quality all its own. Hitler's laugh was so faint it barely registered as sound. I underestimated the quantity. Bergdorf added quietly, we all did. Hitler's gaze drifted toward the far wall, where a portrait of Frederick the Great hung crookedly from the last bombing tremor. Once a symbol of perseverance and iron resolve, now it looked like a relic staring back with judgment. He whispered, Frederick fought when his nation was dying. But he never faced an enemy with infinite resources. Bergdorf lowered his eyes. What are your orders? Hitler didn't speak. Not immediately. His mind drifted back to that day, December 11, 1941, when he had stood before the Reichstag, convinced he was crowned by destiny. He remembered the thunderous applause, the pounding of fists on desks, the wave of fanatic praise crashing over him. He had felt immortal. Untouchable. The master of Europe. And in one speech, he had sealed his defeat. He finally exhaled. I committed the greatest strategic error in our history. His voice trembled not out of fear, but realization. I challenged the one enemy who could never be defeated by will alone. He rose slowly from his chair. He walked to the map of the world pinned to the wall, its edges curling from humidity. He touched the eastern seaboard of the United States. His finger traced down to the Gulf of Mexico, over Texas, then west across California. He whispered, I saw a divided nation. I did not see an empire in disguise. Bergdorf watched him silently. Hitler turned his gaze back to Europe, a continent shattered, carved apart by red and blue arrows closing in from all directions. America did not need to conquer Europe, Hitler murmured. They simply had to arrive. And when they did, everything I built began to crumble. The bunker shook as another bomb detonated overhead, but Hitler barely reacted. He leaned forward, hands gripping the table, and whispered the truth he had never spoken aloud, not even to himself: the war was lost the moment I declared it. There it was. The ultimate admission. The weight that crushed the myth. Bergdorf stood frozen, unable to speak. After a long silence, Hitler slowly sank back down into his chair, shoulders sagging, his shadow small against the bunker wall. He stared at the maps, the reports, the empty space where hope used to be. And he whispered one final sentence, one only Bergdorf heard: America was the enemy I should never have awakened. The bunker hummed faintly. The walls felt closer. And the last flicker of Hitler's confidence guttered out like a dying flame.